Hello and welcome back to the first Halloween video of the year. Hopefully this is going to wind up going up first. If not, then I apologize for this introduction. Anyway, today I'm going to be talking about Tom Waits, who I don't think I've actually ever talked about on the channel before. I think I've maybe mentioned him a few times, but I've never talked about any of his albums. And more specifically, we're going to be talking about Rain Dogs, which I think is generally agreed to be the critical classic album of Tom Waits' career, the one you're supposed to buy first, the one I checked out first, the first one I bought. And now, with Tom Waits, I feel like you really have to talk about where he came from, because where he came from is not where he wound up. He's still making music to this day, by the way. And it's certainly not what this album is, because Tom Waits started out in the early 70s as a singer-songwriter, and it's worth noting that I've actually seen a lot of comparisons of early Tom Waits with Bruce Springsteen, who I know I haven't mentioned on this channel before, but all you really need to know about that is I really don't like Bruce Springsteen. I wish I could like him, because he's a critically loved artist and so many people adore his work, but I just cannot stand his stuff. I just can't. It immediately puts me in a bad mood. And why do I mention this connection? Well, because there is a track on this album that kind of sounds like Bruce Springsteen, but it's really good. There's also, bizarrely enough, a track on the first Peter Gabriel album that sounds like Bruce Springsteen. But there are two real components to Tom Waits, certainly to his original style, and I would argue largely to his modern style as well. You know, the first is the Bob Dylan-y sort of singer-songwriter thing, the really obvious thing, you know, that which was huge in the early 70s when Tom Waits started out. And the second thing, and I think the one that people talk about a little less, but I think it's in some ways even more important, is sort of like Frank Sinatra, you know, kind of lounge singer, you know, crooner sort of, but especially like the cocktail jazz kind of singer, you know, sleazy guy in a third or fourth rate bar with a mediocre band backing him, and he's really only there to make pleasant noise for people to drink to. And I feel like that aesthetic thing is arguably the core of Tom Waits' entire persona and his entire musical career, because there's an element of that in every era of Tom Waits. It's definitely most pronounced in his early stuff, you know, all the stuff he did up to before 1983. It's definitely, that's where you'll find that spirit, but I think it persists throughout his entire career. And what I actually don't hear as much, and this is interesting because it's what people always talk about, is Captain Beefheart. Because every time you talk about later Tom Waits, people talk about Captain Beefheart. And there is a reason for that. Tom Waits got married, I believe, before Swordfish Trombones, and his wife actually introduced him to Trout Mask Replica, and Tom Waits hearing that album was this turning point in his career where, you know, the music he made before he heard Beefheart and the music he made after he heard Beefheart are completely different. You know, there is shared DNA, but they are radically different. And I think almost everyone, well, maybe not, who knows, most people I know seem to agree that the music he made post Trout Mask Replica is way better than the music he made before that point. I think both are good in their own way, but I have to agree. The post Swordfish Trombone stuff is way better. But I actually don't think Captain Beefheart is that big of an influence. I mean, he takes parts of Beefheart's aesthetic, you know, like the really scratchy, rough, abrasive kind of howling wolf vocals, which he always had, but he doubles down on them. And like the off-key, sort of off-kilter, sort of psycho blues thing, he takes and he uses that, and the songwriting also gets way darker. But at his core, I don't think there's as much influence as people often say there is, because I don't hear the connection. Beefheart, and I think a lot of it is what I said. Beefheart very much is blues-based, whereas Tom Waits his background is singer-songwriter and kind of like cocktail lounge jazz, that kind of thing. And those two things are so different, and they don't really mesh. But we got to talk about Rain Dogs, because it's almost 5 minutes in. Anyway, Rain Dogs is the masterpiece. It is the album everybody knows. It's the album everybody goes to first. It's one of those rare albums that has been critically loved pretty much since day one. And you listen to it, it's not exactly hard to hear why. This album came out at the height of 80s-ness, sort of digital production cheese. The era where everything was just drenched in 3 inches of plasticine muck. Every drum was electronic. Every song had to have synths, all over it. And the album has none of that. It's remarkably organic sounding. It's very sort of rootsy. And that kind of extends to the music on the whole. This is music that absolutely does not fit anywhere in time. Lyrically, it's all very old. He's singing about like the Depression and the way things were in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, more so the 30s and 40s, maybe in the 20s. Sort of hobo and tramp characters he loves to portray. And then of course there's the whole, like I said in the intro, the sleazy guy at the 4th-rate bar singing while people get drunk. There's that. But the music is completely distinct from that, with the exception of a couple tracks. And so you get this really weird situation where this is music that feels like it belongs to a different time and place. This doesn't feel like it belongs in the mid-80s, but by the same token, it doesn't really belong anywhere. And I think that's a huge part of why Tom Waits has endured the way he has, is that his music is very timeless in the real sense of the word, and that it doesn't feel attached to any particular time in a way that his earlier stuff does. You listen to Closing Time, and that's an album from the early 70s, and even if you don't know the production trends, you will get a sense that it's an album from the early 70s, but you do not get that sense from his 80s work or his 90s work, again, unless you know the production trends of the time, which even then, like I said, this record doesn't sound like it was made in the mid-80s. Swordfish Trombones doesn't sound like it was made in the early 80s. And with the Bruce Springsteen connection, it is interesting to sort of point out, and again, I kind of wish I liked Bruce Springsteen more, because I feel like there is a very interesting comparison to be made between the two, but especially between this album and the most recent Bruce Springsteen album, which was Born in the USA, which came out the previous year. And you look at them, and the difference between them is night and day, because this is very original, it's very interesting, it's very unique, and it's very, like I was saying, timeless. Whereas Born in the USA is dated sharply to 1984, and it embodies pretty much all of what I was talking about earlier about sort of the bad trends of the decade. And it's interesting to me, as I sit here and try to mull this over, because I improvise most of these videos, especially ones like this, how everything I have to say about the album is pretty much an observation on post-Swordfish Trombones Tom Waits himself. I don't actually, and I think that's why I didn't want to take this track by track, is that I actually don't have that much to say about it track by track, but when you sort of zoom out and you look at Tom Waits in general and this album as it relates to Tom Waits, I have a ton to say about that. But I don't have a whole lot to say about the specific tracks. In terms of songwriting, the album is very diverse. It's kind of a kaleidoscopic view of, the seedy underbelly of America. And by the way, I was wrong. There's actually 2 songs that sound like Bruce Springsteen on the album, Downtown Train and Hang Down Your Head, both of which I love, by the way. It's just interesting how when one guy does it, I find it awesome, but when another guy does it, I can't stand it. But anyway, you've got cool jazzy instrumental tracks, you've got more upbeat, rootsy stuff, ballads, etc., weird instrumentals. I think Midtown is the one I'm thinking of there. Just really weird stuff. Like I said earlier, I don't really have a whole lot to say about specific songs and things specifically about them, but the album as a whole is fascinating, and I highly recommend you listen to it. Even if you haven't liked this review and you've thought, like, what is this guy talking about? He's just droning on and on. He's just miserable. What is he talking about? Go out and listen to the album, because the album is much better than I could ever possibly describe. And it's another sort of situation where, if you know me, a lot of the times I do not like albums that are kind of, underground stuff that was not in the mainstream at the time, that the critics raised up and said, this is the good stuff. This is the better than the tripe you plebeians are listening to. I tend to dislike it when critics do that. This is one of those rare cases where something that they said that about is actually as good as they say it was. And it's actually something that I think stands head and shoulders over 90% of everything that was in the mainstream in 1985 and 1986. So anyway, as I said, Rain Dogs, fantastic album. Go out and listen to it today. And I'll be back next time with the traditional Alice Cooper review for Halloween. So until then, see ya.